Rick Harrison, the famous pawnbroker, became a familiar face to millions of viewers through the hit television show Pawn Stars. With his calm demeanor and remarkable success in the pawn business, Rick had built a strong empire, becoming a symbol of intelligence and business acumen. However, his life was faced with an unexpected turning point, a moment that few could have anticipated. A trial that at first seemed to be a simple financial dispute. But it uncovered a shocking truth that no one could have imagined. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense and suffocating as evidence was presented and arguments were made. All eyes were on Rick, and when the final verdict was announced, the empire he had spent years building suddenly collapsed in the blink of an eye. It was a moment Rick would never forget, a mental shock that forced him to confront the harsh reality. Everything he had once had, everything he had worked for, had changed forever. Were you shocked by the verdict in Rick Harrison's trial? If you think it was a surprise, leave a comment with the number 1, and if not, leave a comment with the number 0. Don't forget to like, share the video, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to enjoy the video and support the channel by subscribing. Now let's dive into the story. But what truly shocked the entire United States? It wasn't just the financial or legal issues, but a startling secret that rocked public opinion. Are you ready to uncover this untold story? Keep reading. The truth will be revealed now. Rick Harrison, a familiar face on Pawn Stars, shocked the world when he was convicted of being involved in a heinous crime, human trafficking. What makes this story even more surprising and shocking is not the crime itself, but how the antiques and precious artifacts that Rick built his empire with became a crucial link in a transnational criminal network. Rick Harrison's pawn shop, where millions of people have watched historical treasures, suddenly became a part of a dark chain of transactions that was previously unimaginable. Initially, investigators were looking for signs of tax evasion or money laundering, but as they dug deeper, a horrifying secret emerged. Stolen valuable items, including paintings, coins, and historical artifacts, were being used as trading instruments in a human trafficking network. These traffickers used these items to fund modern-day slavery operations, forcing women and children into the hands of criminals without a chance of escape. When the verdict was read, everything seemed to collapse right before Rick Harrison's eyes. The name that once commanded admiration, that of a successful, smart, and visionary man, was now exposed in a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. An empire built on knowledge, perseverance, and a passion for collecting had now become intertwined with a dark story that even Rick himself could not have imagined. Though known as a symbol of the American dream, a regular man who became a millionaire, sharing his knowledge and passion with viewers for years, behind the spotlight lay untold stories. Initially, rumors of shady transactions were just whispers within the community until an investigation was launched and everything gradually came to light. The most frightening discovery was that Rick, whether intentionally or unintentionally, had become a part of an international criminal network without even knowing it. His pawn shop, with its well-established reputation, had inadvertently become an intermediary for transactions related to human trafficking. And although Rick Harrison was not the mastermind, his involvement in this crime had shaken every value he had once stood for. The big question, after all the verdicts and truths were revealed, was whether Rick was truly the mastermind behind this horrifying crime, or if he was simply a victim in a game he couldn't control. The truth remained a mystery, and while the court had delivered its judgment, questions continued to be raised about Rick Harrison's actual role in this dark story. The prosecution painted a grim and disturbing picture. Rick Harrison's pawn shop was not only a place for valuable antiques, but also a crucial link in the international human trafficking network. They detailed how stolen artifacts were used as bargaining chips in secret deals that took place under the bright lights of the shop. In this picture, Rick is not just a businessman, he has also become a payment hub for criminals, where dirty money is laundered and profits soaked in blood. The evidence presented in court was heavy and undeniable. The testimonies of the victims, whose lives had been destroyed by human trafficking, exposed the connection between the items sold at Rick's shop and the criminal organization that ensnared them in such a painful cycle. The reports shattered the facade that Rick had built over the years, leaving the courtroom engulfed in stunned silence. The defense continued to tirelessly defend Rick's image, asserting that he was simply a man caught up in a conspiracy he did not fully understand. They argued that Rick was a victim of a dark game and that he was not the mastermind but rather a pawn in a criminal network too intricate to be seen. However, the public was deeply divided. Some people still believed in Rick, a man who had spent his life building a legitimate empire and became a beloved symbol for fans. They believed he could not have known what was happening behind the doors of his shop. But others were less willing to accept that. They questioned how, with his sharp eyes and deep knowledge of antiques, Rick could have failed to notice the irregularities in the transactions. Did he turn a blind eye for profit? Or worse, did he intentionally turn a blind eye and aid in these illegal activities? The courtroom became a battleground for two opposing viewpoints. On one side, Rick was portrayed as an ambitious man who used his shop as a facade for criminal activity. On the other, he was seen as a fool who didn't realize he had been swept up in a game far beyond his understanding. But regardless of who was right or wrong, one thing was undeniable. When the verdict was announced, the atmosphere in the room froze. A crime against humanity. It was just a simple verdict, yet enough to shatter everything. It wasn't tax evasion. It wasn't counterfeiting money. It was a horrific crime that had destroyed countless lives. And this was a verdict that would forever change how Rick Harrison was perceived. Once a symbol of success and the American dream, the man who was loved on Pawn Stars was now the center of a criminal case that shook the world. Rick's downfall was not just the end of one man, but the painful end of a dream admired by many. Rick Harrison's journey from a small pawn shop in Las Vegas to the heights of fame had culminated in a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. As he sat silently in the courtroom, his face pale and his body trembling, it wasn't the cold desert wind that shook him, but the clear realization of the catastrophe unfolding before him. From that moment on, everything changed forever. The empire Rick had built, once a symbol of reality television and the American dream, had collapsed in the blink of an eye. From a pawn shop clerk to an international TV star, His journey had ended in pain and darkness. Every step, every decision that led him to the pinnacle of glory now felt like a distant past. As Rick's lawyers prepared for the next steps, the painful truth slowly sank in. This wasn't just the end of a trial, it was the end of a chapter, an empire, and a legend. The consequences of this verdict extend beyond the courtroom, impacting everything Rick had built. His pawn shop, once a popular destination for collectors worldwide, had now become a name tainted by scandal. His show, Pawn Stars, which had once captivated millions of viewers, was now forever linked to an unforgivable crime. The final judgment not only sealed the fate of one man, but also marked the end of an era. The gavel falling marked the end of the American dream. Rick Harrison, once a symbol of entrepreneurship and a man who believed that anyone could rise above others with hard work and determination, was now a painful reflection of his own downfall. If there is a next chapter in Rick Harrison's life, it will be a dark and challenging one. He had spent his life building knowledge, working hard, and dedicating himself. But in the end, those values were not enough to withstand the storm that swept everything away. Whether through his actions or his inactions, the consequences have now become a harsh reality, and they will haunt him for the rest of his life. Rick Harrison's story was once the perfect example of the American dream: success, determination, and the ability to overcome adversity. The reports shattered the facade Rick had built over the years, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. The defense team tirelessly worked to protect Rick's image, asserting that he was merely a man caught in a conspiracy he didn't fully understand. They argued that Rick was a victim of a dark game, and that he was not the mastermind, but a pawn in a criminal network too intricate to see. However, the public was deeply divided. Some still believed in Rick, a man who had spent his life building a legitimate empire and was once a beloved symbol to his fans. They believed he couldn't have known what was happening behind the doors of his shop. But others were unwilling to accept that. They questioned how, with his sharp eyes and deep knowledge of antiques, Rick could have failed to notice the irregularities in the transactions. Did he turn a blind eye for profit? Or worse, did he intentionally turn a blind eye and assist in illegal activities? The courtroom became a battleground for two opposing viewpoints. On one side, Rick was portrayed as an ambitious man who used his shop as a facade for criminal activity. On the other, he was seen as a fool who didn't realize he had been swept up in a game far beyond his understanding. But regardless of who was right or wrong, one thing was undeniable. When the verdict was announced, the atmosphere in the room froze. A crime against humanity. It was just a simple verdict, yet enough to shatter everything. It wasn't tax evasion, it wasn't counterfeiting money. It was a horrific crime that had destroyed countless lives. And this was a verdict that would forever change how Rick Harrison was perceived. Once a symbol of success and the American dream, the man who was loved on Pawn Stars was now the center of a criminal case that shook the world. Rick's downfall was not just the end of one man, but the painful end of a dream admired by many. Rick Harrison's journey from a small pawn shop in Las Vegas to the heights of fame had culminated in a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. As he sat silently in the courtroom, his face pale and his body trembling, it wasn't the cold desert wind that shook him, but the clear realization of the catastrophe unfolding before him. From that moment on, everything changed forever. The empire Rick had built, once a symbol of reality television and the American dream, had collapsed in the blink of an eye. From a pawnshop clerk to an international TV star, his journey had ended in pain and darkness. Every step, every decision that led him to the pinnacle of glory now felt like a distant past. As Rick's lawyers prepared for the next steps, the painful truth slowly sank in. This wasn't just the end of a trial, it was the end of a chapter, an empire, and a legend. The consequences of this verdict extend beyond the courtroom, impacting everything Rick had built. His pawn shop, once a popular destination for collectors worldwide, had now become a name tainted by scandal. His show, Pawn Stars, which had once captivated millions of viewers, was now forever linked to an unforgivable crime. The final judgment not only sealed the fate of one man, but also marked the end of an era. The gavel falling marked the end of the American dream. Rick Harrison, once a symbol of entrepreneurship and a man who believed that anyone could rise above others with hard work and determination, was now a painful reflection of his own downfall. If there is a next chapter in Rick Harrison's life, it will be a dark and challenging one. He had spent his life building knowledge, working hard, and dedicating himself. But in the end, those values were not enough to withstand the storm that swept everything away. Whether through his actions or his inactions, the consequences have now become a harsh reality, and they will haunt him for the rest of his life. Rick Harrison's story was once the perfect example of the American dream: success, determination, and the ability to overcome adversity. But the heartbreaking reality is that this man, once known for his sharp business acumen, couldn't escape the traps that the world set for him. Rick Harrison, born on March 22, 1965, in Lexington, North Carolina, had a childhood far from the easy, picture-perfect life many might imagine. As a young boy, Rick faced a significant challenge: epilepsy. This health condition not only made it difficult for the young boy to move freely, but also set him apart from his peers. While other children played, participated in sports, and enjoyed their childhoods, Rick had to learn to live with sudden seizures and the isolation that came with the condition. Yet, in the shadow of this illness, a deep passion began to ignite within him. A love for history. His curiosity about the past, stories, and artifacts from ancient times became a source of comfort and motivation for him, as well as a guiding force for his future. The image of his father, Richard Benjamin Harrison Sr., became one of the most important influences in Rick's life. A veteran who took on numerous jobs to support the family, his father instilled in Rick the value of hard work, discipline, and most importantly, a deep respect for history. He was the first to teach Rick the value of discipline, hard work, and most importantly, how to appreciate items of historical value. These lessons were not only taught through words, but also through every step Rick took, becoming the solid foundation for his entire career. In 1989, after struggling with health issues and an unstable career, Rick decided to open a small pawn shop in Las Vegas. With financial support and advice from his father, he began to build his dream from the humblest of beginnings. Rick's first shop was located in a bustling area of Las Vegas, where pawn shops were packed tightly together, fiercely competing with notorious gamblers, tourists, and dreamers seeking their luck. The early years were not easy, but for Rick, the pawn shop was more than just a place to make a living. It was a mission. He saw his shop not as an ordinary retail store, but as a living treasure chest, where each item had its own story and where history was passed on, continuing its journey. From ancient coins to priceless works of art, Rick approached every item not only with the eye of an expert, but with the heart of someone who deeply valued the past. With hard work, deep knowledge, and an unrelenting passion, Rick began to build his reputation. Customers came not just to buy and sell, but to find in his pawn shop a space where the past and present intersected. Rick's reputation grew, drawing the attention of the media. From a small shop, Rick Harrison gradually stepped into the spotlight, preparing to write a bright new chapter in his career journey. Las Vegas, famous for its larger-than-life personalities, became the perfect backdrop for a unique reality television show that combined the thrill of hunting for antiques with tense negotiations. In 2009, the History Channel launched Pawn Stars, a show that followed Rick Harrison and his family as they ran the gold and silver pawn shop in the heart of Las Vegas. Each episode was a new adventure, with customers walking into the shop with rare, sometimes forgotten treasures. The allure of the show came not only from the unique items, but also from how Rick and his team handled them. From negotiating prices to authenticating the items and telling the historical stories behind each piece, Pawn Stars captivated audiences and made Rick a household name. Rick's negotiating style, decisive, sometimes blunt, but always sharp, made him a familiar and beloved face. He not only brought laughter to viewers, but also shared valuable historical knowledge, making the show both entertaining and educational. With its perfect blend of entertainment and education, Pawn Stars quickly became a television phenomenon, attracting millions of viewers and turning Rick Harrison and his family into global television stars. This success not only changed Rick's life, but also transformed the fate of the gold and silver pawn shop. The shop became a famous tourist destination in Las Vegas, attracting thousands of visitors every day just to see the place where hundreds of beloved episodes were filmed. Alongside the success of the show, Rick expanded his personal brand. He published the best-selling book License to Pawn, Deals, Steals, and My Life at the Gold and Silver, where he shared insights into his life, work, and the journey of building his pawn empire. In addition, Rick made appearances on talk shows, commercials, and public events, becoming an icon of the American pawn industry, depicting himself as a hard-working, honest, and passionate man who had preserved history. However, like all the great rewards that come with fame, it also comes at a cost. Rick's fame and wealth attracted not only fans, but also those looking to profit from it. Over the years, Rick faced various accusations, from fraud to unethical business practices. Despite these challenges, he remained loyal to his core values: integrity, passion for history, and dedication to the items he handled. But no empire is immune to challenges. As gold and silver pawn shop grew into a global brand, operations became more complex than ever. The huge customer base, dozens of employees to manage, and ongoing media crises required Rick to constantly adapt and evolve to maintain his position. What Rick didn't foresee was that this very success would create the first cracks in his empire. Behind the scenes, a dark world began to form. Criminal organizations, drawn to the wealth and influence of gold and silver, started to set their sights on Rick's pawn shop. Before long, Rick Harrison's name was no longer just associated with the brand and history, but also linked to rumors and suspicions about shady connections and illicit transactions he never could have imagined. When the trial officially began and the evidence was presented, a darker picture of Rick Harrison's empire emerged. The world that Rick had built around historical artifacts, valuable antiques, and unique collectibles, things that had made his name and success, now found themselves entangled in a criminal trafficking network. Items that once brought him global fame were now symbols of a much darker story. The world Rick had worked so hard to create over years of dedication and reputation building was now on the brink of collapse. Ironically, this downfall wasn't due to any intentional mistakes on Rick's part, but rather forces beyond his control. This was the pivotal moment in Rick Harrison's remarkable rise from a small pawnbroker in Las Vegas to a global reality TV icon, leading to his inevitable and tragic collapse. Rick had spent his entire life building a reputation based on knowledge, hard work, and integrity. With Pawn Stars, he shared his passion for history and propelled the gold and silver pawn shop to the pinnacle of fame. However, beneath the surface of success, small cracks began to appear. The issues weren't large at first, but quietly, like a storm gathering dark clouds. The trouble didn't come suddenly. It started to seep in like harmless whispers, rumors about shady transactions and unethical business practices. At first, they were just murmurs, doubts that surrounded any successful empire. But gradually, the rumors became an issue that couldn't be ignored. The first and most serious accusation was tax evasion. For any business, being under scrutiny by tax authorities is a major issue. But for someone as famous as Rick, every move was closely watched by the public. Even the smallest mistake, whether true or just a rumor, could have catastrophic consequences. And in this case, the whispers quickly turned into a roar. As the authorities began to intervene, the situation became even more serious. The financial records of the gold and silver pawn shop were thoroughly examined. Every pawn transaction, every item, even every coin was scrutinized in detail. The main concern was the origin of the valuable items, from ancient coins to historically significant artifacts. Some items appeared to have questionable origins, possibly linked to illegal activities or theft. The business, once a symbol of trust and expertise, was now under intense scrutiny from both the law and the public. And this was just the beginning of a series of events that would forever alter the fate of this famous pawn shop. Las Vegas, the city that never sleeps, had always been a destination for millions seeking fortune and unique experiences. In this bright picture, Rick Harrison's gold and silver pawn shop had emerged as a cultural icon, drawing tourists from all over thanks to the Pawn Stars television show. Here, history and valuable antiques had become the crossroads between the past and the present. However, behind that glamorous facade, a dark secret was slowly being revealed. Rick Harrison now faced serious allegations related to illegal activities. While he always maintained his innocence, claiming that the work of a pawn shop owner was simply to assess and trade items based on market value without being able to verify the origins of each item, the situation was becoming more complicated. With a commitment to always adhering to transparent and lawful practices, Rick stated that his transactions were never involved in any wrongdoing. However, the investigation quickly uncovered shocking findings. Some of the items displayed in the shop were closely linked to an international human trafficking network. Valuable antiques, once considered collectibles, were actually being traded to facilitate the illegal transportation of people across borders. The story was no longer about selling antiques. It was now part of a global criminal conspiracy. Investigators discovered that criminals had used pawn shops like Rick's to launder money, legitimize stolen assets, including valuable paintings, jewelry, rare coins, and historical artifacts. These items were not only being traded as regular goods, but also served as bargaining chips to transport victims, mainly women and children, across borders. What started as suspicions about the origins of goods quickly turned into a full-scale investigation into human trafficking, one of the most brutal and dangerous crimes of the modern world. Rick was shocked by the accusations. He never imagined that the shop he had built, with the image of a typical American businessman, could be exploited in this way. Rick maintained that he was a victim of a larger conspiracy and had no knowledge of any illegal activities taking place in his shop. His legal team emphasized that it was impossible to monitor every pawn transaction and that he had always trusted his customers, committing to uphold integrity in his business. However, the prosecution presented a series of irrefutable pieces of evidence, including testimonies from human trafficking victims, suspicious transactions, and clear links between some of the shop's items and money laundering and international human trafficking activities. The story quickly attracted media attention, turning Rick from a respected businessman into the center of a massive scandal. Fans of Pawn Stars began to question whether they had been deceived all along. As the trial progressed, Rick found himself not only facing serious legal consequences, but also struggling to protect his reputation and career. Regardless of his innocence, it was undeniable that Rick Harrison's life and the image of the gold and silver pawn shop would never be the same again. Rick Harrison's pawn shop, once a symbol of success and pride in Las Vegas, was now entangled in one of the most shocking crimes in recent memory. The valuable antiques that once mesmerized the shop and Pawn Stars now carried a dark story tied to an international criminal network. What shocked the world even more was that Rick, a man who built his empire on trust and integrity, had unknowingly become a link in a vast criminal network. How could someone with a long history of recognizing the value of rare items fail to notice the signs of suspicious activity happening right in his own shop? The answer wasn't simply carelessness. The truth was even more terrifying. Rick's pawn shop might have inadvertently become part of a global criminal network where money launderers and system manipulators had hidden their tracks for years. Investigators uncovered a disturbing and unusual pattern of transactions involving pawned items at Rick's shop. These items were not just goods. They were being smuggled across borders from Canada, Mexico, and even to Europe to fund human trafficking. The most chilling discovery was a rare antique necklace that had been sold at Rick's store, which was later confirmed to belong to an Eastern European woman, a victim of human trafficking. This item was used as a bargaining chip in her harrowing journey through the hands of human traffickers, and the money obtained from selling it was used to continue funding the exploitation of more innocent victims. Rick was not the mastermind. However, the fact that his store unintentionally became a key link in the global human trafficking chain caused a shocking surprise. His reputation as a successful, knowledgeable, and upright businessman was now tarnished by crimes he never intended to be involved in. Rick's legal team immediately launched a crisis management strategy, asserting that he had no knowledge of the illegal transactions and had always complied with the law. They emphasized that Rick had fully cooperated with the authorities and was willing to provide all necessary documentation. However, the prosecution painted an entirely different picture. They questioned why someone with Rick's sharp eye and experience could not have recognized the signs of unlawful activity happening right under his nose. The media quickly picked up the story, and social media became abuzz with speculation and rumors. Rick's image as a friendly, familiar figure from Pawn Stars was now replaced by that of an accomplice or someone who turned a blind eye to the suffering of innocent victims for his own personal gain. The prosecution presented a series of irrefutable pieces of evidence, from transaction records, items linked to human trafficking victims, to testimony from previous victims. Everything came together to paint a clear picture of Rick's and his shop's involvement, albeit unintentionally, in one of the most horrifying criminal activities of the century. For Rick, this incident was not just a blow to his reputation, but also a personal and professional disaster. He, who had once prided himself on being an honest businessman, now had to face the reality that the empire he had built may have inadvertently caused the suffering of hundreds of innocent victims. The pawn shop, once a symbol of the American dream, had now become a symbol of a modern nightmare. The trial had ended, but the consequences of this case, not just for Rick Harrison, but for reality television as a whole, would continue to haunt the public for a long time. Under the cold lights of the courtroom, Rick Harrison, who had once been an icon of confidence and success through the show Pawn Stars, now sat quietly at the defendant's table. From a beloved pawnbroker, adored by the public, Rick now faced a monumental battle not only in the courtroom, but in his own life. His face bore the marks of a long mental battle. His eyes were sunken from lack of sleep and stress, something fans of the famous television show had never seen. The wrinkles on his forehead, the restless gestures, all reflected the anxiety and turmoil he was going through. The image of the man who once ran a television empire had completely changed. He was no longer the man proud of his success. Now he was a man facing the devastating consequences of his life. The filming sessions, the cheerful conversations had all become painful memories. The trial began like a drama, and all eyes were on the main stage, the courtroom. The atmosphere was thick with tension, with every statement, every piece of evidence from the prosecution quietly fueling the flames of a major case. Journalists, cameras, and flashes couldn't diminish the gravity of this event. A man who had once been a symbol of success in the eyes of the public now faced unfathomable charges. The prosecution had prepared meticulously, and from the very beginning, they made it clear to the public that Rick was a key link in an international human trafficking ring. Every statement, every piece of evidence presented sent shivers through those in attendance. Rick's defense team countered, firmly asserting that he was the victim of a grand conspiracy he had no knowledge of. This was not just a fight for Rick's freedom. It was a battle to protect the reputation he had worked so hard to build over the years. The prosecutor, an experienced woman, began with a shocking statement detailing the brutality of the international human trafficking network, where people were sold like commodities. She accused that the antiques pawned at Rick's shop were being used to launder money for human trafficking operations. Each accusation cut through the tense atmosphere in the courtroom like a sharp knife, making those in attendance shudder at the brutal truth of such a vile crime. Camera flashes kept flickering, and the truth was slowly being exposed, irreversible. Whispers filled the room as people began to imagine the cruelty this case was unveiling. Stories of human trafficking victims, the tortured lives of those enslaved, made the audience feel heartbroken. However, Rick's defense team, led by a veteran criminal defense attorney, presented an entirely different argument. They did not deny the gravity of the charges, but they emphasized that Rick had no knowledge of the illegal transactions taking place in his store. They stated that Rick's shop had always been run with integrity and had never been involved in any criminal activities. They argued that the evidence presented by the prosecution had been misunderstood or distorted, and they demanded that this evidence be re-examined thoroughly. They portrayed Rick as an honest man, unaware of the truth behind the items he pawned. This legal battle was not about a simple question. Was Rick deliberately involved in this criminal network, or was he just an innocent man caught in a game he had no knowledge of? The deeper question this trial raised was whether a man once beloved by the public could collapse under the weight of such serious criminal charges. As the prosecution continued to present a series of compelling pieces of evidence, some of which were extremely detailed and heartbreaking, it became clear that this trial was not just about uncovering the truth. It was about a crucial decision regarding faith, honor, and the legacy of a man and a beloved television icon. The suspense and tension in the courtroom heightened as new evidence was revealed, including videos documenting shady transactions and testimonies from witnesses showing the links between Rick's shop and transnational criminal organizations. The priceless antiques that Rick had once been proud of were no longer just historical artifacts, but became vehicles for concealing crimes. These situations not only shattered Rick's life, but also tore apart the trust of millions of viewers. Questions kept being raised. Could Rick truly be a victim in this case? Or was he simply a pawn being exploited in a larger criminal game? As the investigation continued, Rick Harrison's image as a successful businessman, someone who had built his reputation on trust and hard work, was now severely threatened by undeniable allegations. The months of seclusion not only determined Rick Harrison's fate, but also completely changed his career and the way the public perceived this former reality TV star. One of the crucial pieces of evidence in the case was a series of transaction records linking numerous items from Rick's pawn shop to an international human trafficking ring. These items were no longer simply mementos or valuable antiques. They had become parts of a larger criminal conspiracy. Investigators traced the origins of the items in Rick's shop. Many of them had once belonged to victims who had tragically become ensnared in the vicious cycle of crime. Stolen items were found in the hands of human traffickers, and some survivors who had been rescued even came forward to testify. The witnesses shared heartbreaking stories of being lured into slavery or kidnapped across borders, where they were exchanged for valuable goods. One woman, a victim of the trafficking ring, tearfully recounted how her rare painting became part of this trade, and the painting was eventually found in Rick's store. These testimonies pointed to a harsh reality. People had become commodities in transactions where valuable items like paintings, jewelry, and expensive watches were traded and laundered to erase their illegal origins. These items were no longer merely collectibles. They had become mediums of exchange in criminal dealings. The prosecution argued that Rick's pawn shop was an inadvertent link in this human trafficking network, where items were not only sold, but also used to conceal their illegal origins. They pointed out that the money exchanged to purchase these items was funneled back into the criminal enterprise. While Rick was unaware of these transactions, when faced with this evidence, he could not deny the fact that his store had unwittingly become part of a global criminal network. Although Rick's defense team remained adamant in protecting him, arguing that he had no knowledge of the illegal transactions taking place in his shop, the truth could no longer be hidden. They argued that Rick had cooperated with authorities from the outset, opening up records of the transactions and assisting in the pursuit of the real criminals. They emphasized that Rick was a victim of a sophisticated conspiracy and that he had not recognized the signs of illegal activity. However, these defenses seemed insufficient to counter the weight of the evidence presented by the prosecutor. Pawn shop experts were also called to testify, explaining that even someone as experienced as Rick could not have fully controlled the origins of every item in his store. Yet, the prosecutors were unconvinced by this argument. They argued that Rick had willfully ignored the warning signs, drawn in by the prophet, and failed to question the unusually valuable items that started appearing in his shop. Evidence of items with suspicious origins pointed to Rick's negligence in overseeing and managing the transactions, leading to unforeseen consequences. The prosecution contended that Rick's extensive knowledge of antiques and valuable items should have made him suspicious that these items had illegal origins. The trial was not just a legal battle over Rick's guilt, but the tragic fall of a man once adored by the public. Rick, who had been a model of success on Pawn Stars, was now at the center of a devastating scandal no one could have imagined. The recognition of Rick as innocent was no longer a simple matter, as everything he had built was now being sucked into a mire of crime and fraud. His family sat behind him, burdened with sorrow. His son, Corey, who had stood by his father, now appeared heartbroken and fearful. Concerns about the future of their family made the atmosphere even more suffocating. When the final verdict was read, a single brutal word, guilty, sounded like a slap to the face of Rick's last remaining hopes. The man who had once been a symbol of the American dream was now a convicted criminal. If you find this content exciting and full of surprises, don't forget to hit like and share the video with your friends and those around you so they can check it out too. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any more fascinating videos. Now let's move on to the next character. The consequences of this trial were not only the loss of freedom, but also the collapse of everything Rick had built throughout his life. The gold and silver pawn shop, where he had created a television empire and a thriving business, was now surrounded by scandal. News of the case spread rapidly across the media, sparking a powerful public outcry on social media. Fans who had once admired Rick couldn't believe that the knowledgeable and sincere man they had watched for years was now accused of being involved in such a grave crime as human trafficking. Rick's public image had shifted dramatically from being a respected icon to being synonymous with crime. The pawn shop, once bustling with activity, was now eerily quiet. The employees who had once stood by Rick were divided. Running the pawn shop had become a burden, and the image of gold and silver pawn no longer represented success, but had become a symbol of illegal activities. Everything had changed irreparably, as crime and illegality had now become part of a story from which Rick could not escape. The days of seclusion not only determined Rick Harrison's fate, but also completely changed his career and the way the public viewed this former reality TV star. From a small pawn shop owner in Las Vegas who had built a solid television empire, Rick had become a role model for a successful entrepreneur. But now, everything he had built over the years was at risk of being destroyed by an unimaginable scandal. One of the key pieces of evidence in the case was a series of transaction records linking several items from Rick's pawn shop to an international human trafficking network. These items were not merely souvenirs or valuable antiques. They had become integral components of a large criminal conspiracy, part of a chain of brutal cross-border transactions. While Rick may not have been aware of the connection between these items and criminal activities, the fact that these items were directly linked to a human trafficking ring placed his entire career in jeopardy. Investigators traced the origins of the items in Rick's store. Many of these had once belonged to victims who had tragically become ensnared in the web of crime. Stolen items had been found in the hands of traffickers, and several survivors who were rescued spoke out as witnesses. Testimonies from witnesses revealed heartbreaking stories of being deceived, sold, or kidnapped across borders, where these innocent victims were exchanged like commodities for valuable items. These items were no longer just the property of victims. They had become symbols of the pain and humiliation that these individuals had endured. One of the most notable victims was Elena, a young mother from Eastern Europe. Elena was promised a job as a housekeeper in the United States, but upon her arrival, she was imprisoned, beaten, and exploited. Elena recalled that an antique watch, once a symbol of power, was used as a trade to exchange her in a human trafficking deal. The watch was later found to have passed through Rick's shop. For Elena, these precious items were no longer her belongings. but symbols of the pain and humiliation she had endured. Her story, along with those of others, gradually revealed a harsh reality that these items were not just possessions, but also tools of exchange in criminal transactions. When Elena discovered that the item had once been in Rick's store, she was overwhelmed with utter disappointment. She could not fathom that a place she had once trusted could be linked to human trafficking. Regardless of whether Rick knew about his store's involvement in the criminal network, the truth remained undeniable. These items were no longer just goods, they symbolized the lives and suffering of individuals. The prosecution used Elena's testimony to assert that each item was not merely merchandise but a tragic story, and this revelation sent shockwaves through the public. The prosecution argues that Rick's pawn shop was an unintended link in a human trafficking network, where items were not only sold but also used to conceal their illegal origins. They point out that the money exchanged for these items was funneled back into the criminal enterprise. Although Rick had no knowledge of these transactions, when faced with this evidence, he could not deny the fact that his shop had inadvertently become part of a global crime network. However, admitting that his store was involved in criminal activities was not easy for Rick, who had always been proud of the work he had done. While Rick's defense team continues to insist that he knew nothing about the illegal transactions happening in his shop, the truth could not be hidden. They argue that Rick had cooperated with authorities from the beginning, opening up records of transactions and assisting in the search for the real criminals. They also emphasize that Rick was a victim of a sophisticated scheme and did not recognize the signs of illegal activity. However, these defenses seem insufficient to alleviate the weight of the evidence presented by the prosecution. Pawn shop experts were also called in to explain that even someone as experienced as Rick couldn't fully control the origins of every item in his store. However, the prosecutors did not buy this argument. They contended that Rick had deliberately ignored warning signs, caught up in the profits, and failing to question the unusually valuable items that began appearing in his shop. Evidence of suspiciously sourced items pointed to Rick's negligence in overseeing and managing transactions, leading to unforeseen consequences. They argued that his extensive knowledge of antiques and rare artifacts should have raised suspicions about the illicit origins of these items. The trial became not only a legal battle over Rick's guilt, but also a tragic fall from grace for a man once beloved by the public. Rick, who had once been the epitome of success on Pawn Stars, was now embroiled in a devastating scandal no one could have predicted. A verdict of guilty was no longer a simple matter when everything he had built was being dragged into a mire of crime and fraud. His family sat behind him, weighed down with sorrow. His son, Corey, who had stood by his side, now appeared devastated and fearful. The concerns about their family's future made the atmosphere even more suffocating than before. When the final verdict was read, a single, merciless word, guilty, rang out like a slap in the face to Rick's last remnants of hope. The man who was once a symbol of the American dream had now become a criminal. The aftermath of this trial was not only the loss of freedom, but also the collapse of everything Rick had painstakingly built throughout his life. Gold and Silver Pawn, the business where he had established his television empire and business, was now engulfed by scandal. News of the case spread quickly through the media, sparking a powerful wave of public reaction on social media. Fans who had once admired Rick couldn't believe that the knowledgeable and sincere man they had followed for years was now accused of being involved in such a serious crime as human trafficking. Rick's public image had dramatically shifted from a respected icon to a synonym for criminal activity. The once bustling pawn shop was now eerily empty. The employees who had stood by Rick's side were now divided. Running the pawn shop had become a heavy burden, and the image of gold and silver pawn was no longer a symbol of success, but a hideout for illicit activities. Everything had changed irreparably, as crime and illegality had now become a part of the story that Rick could no longer escape. As the investigation progressed, the voices of other victims grew louder. Each victim was a part of the vast and brutal human trafficking network. Many victims were women and children lured by promises of stable jobs, educational opportunities, or a better life. Instead, what they faced was the nightmare of forced labor, sexual exploitation, and physical abuse. The stolen and pawned items were not just possessions but tools of trade, vivid evidence of the sophistication of the criminal network. One particularly heartbreaking testimony came from Maria, a young woman trafficked from Mexico. A nanny job offer in the United States with promises of a bright future led her into a locked home where she was not only stripped of her freedom but also forced to care for the children of a wealthy family without pay. Even worse, the traffickers used valuable items, like a rare diamond necklace, as currency while moving Maria from state to state. That necklace later appeared in Rick Harrison's pawn shop. Maria's story was not just a personal tragedy, but also a testament to how the items in the pawn shop were not mere inanimate objects. They were symbols of stolen lives and shattered destinies. As the investigation deepened, authorities discovered that pawn shops, including Rick's, were being used to launder money and absorb proceeds from crime. Stolen goods became the perfect cover for sophisticated criminals, allowing them to avoid the attention of law enforcement. What initially appeared to be isolated incidents were now connected into a large-scale, organized human trafficking network. Each story from the victims was not only a psychological shock, but also a wake-up call for society about the crimes existing at the heart of the modern world. For Rick Harrison, hearing testimonies like Maria's was a painful awakening. Once someone who had only focused on the business aspect of the pawn shop, he was now confronted with a harsh reality. His shop, though unintentionally, had become a link in the chain of criminal activity. The more he heard about the suffering of the victims, the more he couldn't help but feel pain and guilt. Although he never intended to be part of what was happening, the shift in public opinion was inevitable. Once a beloved television personality and a successful businessman, Rick now found himself caught in a wave of outrage as the dark side of the industry he represented was exposed. The stories of pain and trauma from the victims now dominated the trial, transcending the usual legal context. The prosecution, bolstered by the emotional testimonies from survivors, painted a grim picture of a man who had unknowingly profited from the misfortune of others. While the defense team attempted to argue that Rick had no knowledge of what had occurred, their case increasingly weakened under the emotional weight of the testimony. With each story, Rick's efforts to deny responsibility grew weaker. He even began to feel guilty unintentionally. The items that had passed through his hands, the items tied to lives of suffering, had left a mark on him. No matter how hard he tried to deny it, the truth remained undeniable. His business had inadvertently become a conduit for crime. As the trial continued, the mental and emotional weight on Rick became ever heavier. It was a bitter awakening, not only for him but also for society, about the consequences of greed and how unintentional actions can contribute to dark crimes. Each witness's testimony not only added to the pain of an already complex case, but also made defending Rick Harrison increasingly difficult. The revelations of the crimes and the suffering endured by Rick's victims transformed the trial into a tense, emotionally charged battle, shedding light on every corner of Rick's past. The empire he had built was now on the verge of collapse. His unintentional involvement in the human trafficking network could no longer be ignored. The consequences of his shady dealings left scars not only on the victims' bodies, but also in the minds of the public, and Rick could not escape them. As the trial neared its end, everything came down to one decisive moment. Months of debates, emotional testimonies, and constant media scrutiny had led to the final verdict. However, the consequences extended far beyond the courtroom. They spread into every facet of Rick's life, his career, his business, and his personal relationships. The truth, no matter how painful, could no longer be concealed. Immediately following the verdict, Rick faced a decision that would determine his future. The prosecutors sought a harsh sentence, possibly even prison time, while Rick's defense team relentlessly worked to lessen the charges against him. As the investigation delved deeper into the details, the voices of the victims began to resonate more powerfully, and their stories revealed a brutal truth about a global human trafficking network. Each victim was a part of a larger picture of a sophisticated criminal system where people were traded like commodities. Many of the victims, primarily women and children, were lured by promises of a better life, stable job opportunities, or education for the future. Instead, they were confronted with a nightmare of unimaginable cruelty, where they were forced to work under conditions of coerced labor, sexually exploited, and subjected to physical abuse. The stolen and pawned items were not merely possessions. They had become tools of trade and living proof of the criminal network's sophistication. One particularly heartbreaking testimony came from Maria, a young woman trafficked from Mexico. A nanny job offer in the United States, promising a bright future, led her into a locked house, where she was not only stripped of her freedom, but also forced to care for the children of a wealthy family without compensation. She was confined in a house like a modern-day slave, brutally abused and exploited. Even worse, the traffickers used valuable items, like a rare diamond necklace, as currency while transporting Maria from state to state as part of this inhumane arrangement. The necklace was later discovered to have passed through Rick Harrison's pawn shop. Maria's story was not only a personal tragedy, but also a stark reminder that the items in a pawn shop are not just inanimate objects. They are symbols of stolen lives and shattered destinies. The diamond necklace, once perhaps just a piece of valuable jewelry, had now become a symbol of violation, crime, and boundless suffering. As the investigation deepened, authorities discovered that pawn shops, including Rick's, were being used to launder money and absorb proceeds from criminal activities. Stolen goods had become the perfect cover for sophisticated criminals, allowing them to evade law enforcement attention. What initially appeared to be isolated incidents were now connected into a large-scale, organized human trafficking network. These items were no longer just valuable possessions. They were tools of exchange in dark criminal deals. These items had become commodities in the criminal system, and pawn shops like Rick's, though unintentionally, had become places that helped this network thrive and expand. Each story from the victims was not only a psychological shock but also a warning to society about the crimes that lurked within the heart of the modern world. For Rick Harrison, hearing testimonies like Maria's was a painful awakening. From someone who had always focused solely on the business side of the pawn shop, he was now confronted with a harsh reality. His pawn shop, though unwittingly, had become a link in the chain of crime. The more he heard about the suffering of the victims, the more he could not help but feel pain and guilt. The stories of the hardship faced by those trafficked, turned into commodities in criminal transactions, made it impossible for Rick to simply deny his responsibility. His shop, though unintentionally, had become part of a global crime network. The more Rick heard about the suffering of the victims, the more he couldn't help but feel pain and guilt. Even though he never intended to be involved in what was happening, the shift in public opinion was inevitable. Once a beloved television personality and a successful businessman, Rick now found himself caught in a wave of outrage as the dark side of the industry he represented was exposed. The items that were once valuable assets in his eyes were now pieces of a criminal puzzle from which he couldn't escape. The stories of pain and trauma from the victims were now dominating the trial, transcending the usual legal context. The prosecution, bolstered by emotional testimonies from survivors, painted a bleak picture of a man who had unknowingly benefited from the misfortune of others. While Rick's defense team tried to argue that he was unaware of what had transpired, their arguments increasingly weakened under the emotional weight of the testimony. Witnesses, with vivid stories of how they became victims of human trafficking, had ignited a fire in the courtroom. With each story, Rick's attempts to deny responsibility grew weaker. He even unintentionally felt guilty. The items that had passed through his hands, tied to lives of suffering, had left an indelible mark on him. No matter how hard he tried to deny it, the truth remained. Each story from the victims was a reminder of his responsibility and involvement in a system he had never intended to be a part of. His business had unintentionally become a vehicle for crime. As the trial continued, the mental and emotional burden on Rick grew heavier. It was a bitter awakening, not only for him but also for society at large, about what can happen when greed and negligence inadvertently contribute to dark crimes. The testimony of each witness not only deepened the pain of an already complex case, but also made defending Rick Harrison increasingly difficult. The revelations of the crimes and the suffering his victims endured turned the trial into a tense, emotionally charged battle, shedding light on every corner of Rick's past. The empire he had built was now on the verge of collapse. His unintentional involvement in the human trafficking network could no longer be overlooked. The consequences of his shady dealings left scars not only on the bodies of the victims, but also in the minds of the public, and Rick could not escape them. As the trial neared its end, Everything hinged on a single decisive moment. Months of debates, emotional testimonies, and relentless media scrutiny had led to the final verdict. However, the consequences did not end in the courtroom. They spread into every aspect of Rick's life: his career, his business, and his personal relationships. The truth, no matter how painful, could no longer be hidden. Immediately following the verdict, Rick faced a judgment that would decide his future. The prosecutor sought a harsh sentence, possibly even prison time, while Rick's defense team worked tirelessly to reduce the charges against him. Gold and silver pawn, once a vibrant symbol of Las Vegas, now witnessed a steady decline in customer traffic. What was once a place that drew tourists with the hope of meeting the stars of Pawn Stars was now just a shadow of its former self. The store's reputation had been severely damaged, and it seemed that the damage was irreparable. However, Rick refused to give up. He knew that his legacy was tarnished, but he was determined not to let it end like this. Rick began to act quietly, meeting with partners, former employees, and investors, working together to rebuild the business. He understood that the process of restoration would be long and difficult, but if he wanted to save his future, he had to change the way the public perceived him. Yet the challenges in both finances and the company's image were unavoidable. The emotional toll of the situation was undeniable. Rick was known for his ability to build trust with customers, his family, and the public. But now, those relationships were becoming strained, and mending them was proving to be a formidable challenge. Nevertheless, Rick realized that if he wanted any chance of salvaging his career, he had to keep moving forward. His resilience and determination weren't enough to erase all doubts, but they were the only things keeping him steady in the storm of media scrutiny and public judgment. Although Rick Harrison's legal battle has concluded, his journey is far from over. Despite receiving a lighter sentence than the prosecution sought, due to his cooperation with authorities and lack of prior convictions, the legal consequences persist. Rick was convicted of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, despite his defense team's argument that he was unaware of the illegal activities taking place at his pawn shop. Prosecutors maintained that Rick had unwittingly become a link in a criminal chain, accepting items tied to a human trafficking ring without his knowledge. Despite efforts to keep him out of prison, the court sentenced him to a brief stint behind bars. Short, but shocking for a man once seen as a symbol of success. The prospect of incarceration, even temporarily, was unimaginable. Rick, who had never been involved in crime, now faced an entirely different world. Behind bars, the glamorous life of a TV star gave way to a harsh reality where he was no longer a celebrity, but an ordinary man who had lost everything. The psychological impact of the sentence didn't end when Rick left prison. The stigma will haunt him emotionally and socially long after his sentence is served. Being recognized as innocent in the ordeal is now nearly impossible, as he cannot escape the fact that his pawn shop was unwittingly exploited by traffickers. The fallout affects not only him but also those around him, rippling out to everyone once close to him. The gold and silver pawn shop's business suffered devastating losses. Once the public learned of the shop's connection to human trafficking, customers turned away. The store, once a Las Vegas landmark, was reduced to a place of fear, controversy, and infamy. Tourists no longer flocked to it, and fans of the hit TV show turned their backs. This not only crippled the shop's revenue, but also sent shockwaves through the entire pawn industry and Rick's career. The collapse of gold and silver pawn was one of the greatest losses. It wasn't just Rick who suffered, but also the loyal employees who stood by him. They had dedicated their careers to building the shop, only to watch it crumble. The shock of Rick Harrison's conviction had far-reaching consequences, impacting everyone around him. Longtime employees who helped establish the pawn shop from its early days now face unemployment or personal struggles stemming from the scandal. Once a beloved success story fueled by Pawn Stars, gold and silver pawn is now in decline. Customer traffic has plummeted, and the shop's reputation has been severely tarnished. Many loyal employees who built the business alongside Rick from the start are now jobless. Those who joined after the show's fame face an uncertain future, and Rick's family remains unable to escape the scandal's fallout. The son of Rick Harrison, Corey Harrison, who runs the pawn shop alongside his father and is a familiar face on Pawn Stars, has always seen his father as a role model and mentor. However, their relationship has grown strained since the verdict. Corey has been forced to take on the responsibility of managing the shop in his father's absence, a daunting task, especially as the empire they built together crumbles. These pressures have complicated their bond, as Corey must balance stepping into his father's role while trying to keep the business afloat. For Rick, the consequences extend beyond prison time. They include the destruction of the life he worked so hard to build. Once an admired entrepreneur who leveraged his fame to expand into books and business ventures, Rick is now synonymous with scandal. His once bright aura has faded, replaced by suspicion, discrimination, and loss, not only from the public, but also from the family and employees who once trusted him. The glory days are now a distant memory, while the harsh reality he faces daily defines the remainder of his life. Even after his release, Rick carries the stigma of a convicted felon, making it nearly impossible to return to work or live a normal life. The opportunities once available to a celebrated TV star have been brutally and definitively closed. Yet, amid the ruins, Rick has chosen not to give up. Rick understands that the path to redemption will be long and arduous, with no guarantee of full atonement, yet he believes true remorse can only come by confronting his mistakes head-on. Rick doesn't shy away or shift blame to others. He has come to terms with the fact that the business he built, however unintentionally, became a link in a brutal human trafficking network. The items traded at his shop were not just inanimate objects, but represented the lives of exploited and sold individuals. Innocent victims were ensnared in this system, and Rick must face the reality that his shop, one of Las Vegas's most famous landmarks, unwittingly played a role in this crime. Rick knows the damage he caused can never be fully undone, but he can start by facing the truth. The next step is to speak out, act, and show genuine remorse. And he has. After months of silence, Rick finally chose to share his feelings and regret with the public. In an emotional interview, he broke his silence for the first time, confronting his mistakes. With a trembling voice, he acknowledged his unintentional role, expressing profound remorse for what happened. He cannot change the past, but what he can do is take responsibility and strive to make things right. Rick Harrison's interview marked a pivotal moment in his journey toward redemption. It was not just an apology, but a powerful commitment to take action to right his wrongs. He understands that forgiveness cannot come from mere words. It must be earned through consistent, sincere, and tangible efforts. Rick resolved to publicly support organizations combating human trafficking, an issue his pawn shop unwittingly became entangled in. He partnered with nonprofits to aid survivors and support efforts to dismantle these criminal networks. These organizations not only assist trafficking victims, but also work to prevent the networks from further exploiting injustice and suffering. In addition to funding campaigns, Rick also uses his personal influence to raise public awareness, promote educational programs, and support the recovery of victims. While he knows that money cannot erase the past, he believes it can be the catalyst that brings light to the dark corners long forgotten. Rick's efforts go beyond improving his own image. They are aimed at making real societal changes, supporting initiatives that help survivors recover and rebuild their lives. At the same time, Rick focused on rebuilding his business. The once thriving pawn shop had become synonymous with shame. He knew that his reputation had been severely damaged and would not recover quickly. While some of his longtime employees stayed, they were anxious about the future. What had once been a source of pride for them had now become a burden they never asked for. These employees had witnessed all the changes, from the peak to the downfall, and now they too had to face the question of their own future. The biggest question now was whether they could continue working at the shop, given that the work environment had been tainted by scandal. In this situation, Rick decided to open up a dialogue, reassure his staff, and commit to running the shop with the integrity he had always upheld. However, it wasn't just customers who turned away. Rick's brand had also suffered serious damage. Yet Rick wasn't seeking forgiveness. He wanted to prove he deserved it. Rick returned to the core values that had helped his pawn shop thrive: transparency, fairness, and dedication to preserving the shop's history. Every transaction at the store was conducted with the utmost care and honesty. Additionally, he organized training for his employees to recognize and prevent signs of criminal activity, and collaborated with the authorities to ensure the shop would never be exploited again. Along with his efforts to restore the pawn shop, Rick also realized that regaining public trust would be a difficult and lengthy process. He couldn't change the past, but Rick believed that showing sincerity through his actions would help make up for some of what was lost. Above all, what he wanted to prove was that not everything that had happened was by accident, and he would do whatever it took to make amends for the harm he had caused. While he couldn't regain everything he had lost, Rick was determined to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for those who had always believed in him. As Rick's efforts began to bear fruit, the greatest pain for him did not come from public opinion or financial loss, but from his own family. The relationship between Rick and his son, Corey, once built on trust and respect, had shattered after the trial. Rick knew it would take time to heal this relationship, but he also understood that to prove to Corey that he could do better, not only in his work, but also as a father, he had to start by facing the truth and taking bold action. Rick took the initiative to reach out to Corey, expressing deep regret and committing to doing what was right. He understood that mending their relationship would take time and effort, but it was a crucial part of his journey to atone. Rick wanted to show that while mistakes could happen, he remained an honest man, capable of learning from his errors and making things right through action. He hoped that Corey would see his effort and understand that no matter how difficult the situation, he would always be there, striving to be a role model for his family. Over time, Rick's efforts began to bear fruit. The pawn shop, once abandoned and deserted, now welcomed customers once again. Some longtime patrons returned out of loyalty, while others came because they noticed the positive changes Rick had made. While it wasn't a dramatic comeback, it was a noticeable step forward. Rick understood that the key was not to give up. His journey of redemption was ongoing, and each steady step, no matter how small, held great significance for him. This wasn't the end goal, but rather a long and arduous process that required Rick to continue making positive changes and proving that he deserved a second chance. Although he had lost much, his reputation, career, and trust, Rick still had his family, his job, and his self-respect, and he was determined to protect and restore them at any cost. This wasn't just about regaining what he had lost. It was about rebuilding himself into a responsible, conscientious person capable of correcting his mistakes. Though the road ahead was uncertain, Rick Harrison chose to move forward slowly but surely. He understood that salvation wasn't just about self-improvement, but also the difficult task of regaining public trust. Rick was no longer the role model the public once admired. He had faced the most painful failure before the public eye and could not easily reclaim what he had lost. However, it was his determination to make amends and confront his mistakes that helped him rise again and continue moving forward. Amid the relentless criticism, Rick was acutely aware that rebuilding his reputation would require him to navigate the media storm with great care. While he knew that changing public perception was a huge challenge, he was determined to do so. Rick's first step was to face the truth. He wasn't looking to justify or hide behind excuses. Instead, he took full responsibility for the mistakes of the past. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could begin to take the right actions now. This was the moment to prove that he wasn't just talking the talk, but genuinely committed to righting his wrongs. Rick decided to go public, but this time, not in the usual way. He agreed to an exclusive interview with a respected journalist, hoping it would be an opportunity to express his remorse and sincere reflections directly. The interview had no script, no edits, just Rick, a man confronting himself and his mistakes. During the interview, Rick admitted to making a serious mistake and expressed deep regret. He shared how difficult it was to fully articulate his emotions and stressed that he never intended for the situation to unfold the way it did. Rick also emphasized that he never wanted to hurt anyone and never thought his store could be exploited for nefarious purposes. He made it clear that while he wasn't the mastermind, he accepted that his store had inadvertently become a link in a serious criminal chain. However, now Rick had no choice but to face the consequences and do everything in his power to start over. The interview made a strong impression on the public. While it wasn't the perfect apology, it was a sincere effort to acknowledge his mistakes and find ways to make amends. Public opinion was divided. Some remained skeptical, but many began to see Rick in a different light. as someone who had made mistakes but was trying to fix them. The shift in public perception toward Rick was ongoing, but he had begun his journey of redemption. His relentless efforts to improve both himself and his business would serve as a test for a man who had once been beloved, but now had to confront the harsh reality. Yet Rick refused to give up. He knew that even though the road to redemption was long, if he could prove his sincerity and perseverance through his actions, he would have a chance to regain the trust of those who had once placed their hopes in him. As the media continued to dig into the sensational details of Rick's past, his public relations team decided to change the narrative. Instead of continuing to get caught up in the criticisms of past mistakes, they focused on his contributions to anti-human trafficking organizations and his commitment to rebuilding his store transparently and responsibly. The goal was not to erase the past, but to demonstrate that Rick was working to make things right. He not only wanted to prove that he could change, but also show that the truth wasn't about forgetting past mistakes. It was about facing them and making amends. Despite the constant scrutiny from the media regarding his past, the public began to see a different Rick. He was no longer the man simply behind the transactions at the pawn shop, but a store owner working with non-profit organizations, listening to survivors, and using his voice to raise awareness about human trafficking. Gradually, the story of Rick was no longer just a scandal, but about a man trying to make a difference. His sincere efforts to help victims and support anti-crime campaigns began to shift public perception. Over time, some of the public began to forgive. They returned to the shop, supported Rick on social media, and acknowledged his efforts to make amends. While his former reputation may never fully return, Rick understood that redemption wasn't about going back to the past. It was about meaningful actions in the present. You can't change what's happened, but you can change who you are starting today, he thought. The steady steps in his journey to regain public trust wouldn't be easy, but Rick knew that real change came from actions, not empty words. The story of Rick Harrison is not just about a scandal. It's about a man learning from his mistakes, earning back trust, and striving to write a new chapter, one about responsibility, growth, and hope. He wasn't perfect, but he was doing everything he could to become a better person and help those who had been hurt along the way. It was his commitment to action, transparency, and remorse that allowed Rick to begin the process of restoring his reputation and reinventing himself. Thank you for taking the time to watch the entire video. If you found this story interesting and want to learn more from our exciting videos, don't forget to like, share the video, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other exciting videos. We look forward to seeing you in the next one.